Welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us. You're watching our continuous coverage of the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly. I'm Molly Gambhir. A quick check on the top stories.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. Advance human dignity.
Delivering his maiden speech at the UN General Assembly, President Joe Biden, in a reference to ties with China, says the U.S. does not seek a Cold War as he vows to stand up for friends and allies. President Biden says the U.S. would return to the Iranian nuclear deal in full if Tehran does the same, as he urges world leaders to work together to address global challenges like climate change, the pandemic, and terrorism. UN Chief Antonio Guterres laments vaccine inequity across the world, says while some countries continue to have surplus jabs, many countries are witnessing empty shelves. 90% of African countries are still waiting for vaccines. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron hold talks. The two leaders discuss issues related to the Indo-Pacific region as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion French submarine order. Friction between the US, Australia and European countries over the AUKUS partnership grows. Germany slams Australia over ditching the submarine contract with France, says it will be difficult to rebuild trust. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The United Nations voices deep concern at mass U.S. deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the U.S. moves about 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. U.S. President Joe Biden made his debut at the 76th session of the UNGA, his biggest international summit since the botched Afghanistan pullout. Biden stressed on the fact that the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War, acknowledged that the increasing concerns about rising U.S.-China tensions remain. Listen in.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure.
Biden also said that the U.S. will seek a return to Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, if Tehran does the same. Last week saw the minor breakthrough in the nuclear talks, with the UN atomic watchdog and Iran reaching an agreement to avert the nuclear deal crisis.
The United States remains committed to preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. We're working with the P5+1 to engage Iran diplomatically and to seek a return to JCPOA. We're prepared to return to full compliance if Iran does the same.
And as for South Korea, Joe Biden called for a complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, calling for a plan to increase stability in the peninsula. Listen in.
We seek serious and sustained diplomacy to pursue the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. We seek concrete progress toward an available plan with tangible commitments that would increase stability on the peninsula and in the region, as well as improve the lives of the people in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Biden once again called for a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, saying it was the only way forward for peace in the region.
The commitment of the United States to Israel's security is without question, and our support for an independent Jewish state is unequivocal. But I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state.
The U.S. president has been repeatedly criticized for the botched pullout in Afghanistan. But standing at the UNGA, Joe Biden said that for the first time in 20 years, an American president was addressing the General Assembly with the country not at war. He also called for the end of relentless war and the beginning of relentless diplomacy.
We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan. And as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy, of using the power of our development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up around the world, of renewing and defending democracy.
WION-USA Direct from New York with Susan Tehrani.
And our correspondent Susan Tehrani has been joining us with the very latest from New York, dissecting that crucial address delivered by the American president. Susan, let's talk about the issues that the president has addressed, ranging from the friction with China. It's a reference, of course, that he's made when he says that he is not seeking a Cold War. But at the same time, the very mention of a Cold War is enough to grab headlines. And that's something that he has said earlier as well. Tell us more about the backdrop in which this address comes, with the friction with EU over the AUKUS partnership, also the reassurance by Joe Biden to his allies that he will be standing with his friends.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. While he didn't mention China by name, a lot of his speech really did focus not only on China, but the minute that he did start talking about his foreign policy agenda, he really started with the Indo-Pacific region. He did talk about how he wants to really strengthen the Quad partnership. Again, no mention about China on that. He talked about health security, climate, and emerging technologies. He talked about ASEAN. He also talked about how he wants to really work with NATO and how he has been working with NATO and his European Union allies, trying to strengthen his alliances, and how familiar really those lines of his speech at the GA were to his speech in Brussels, perhaps, when he visited as part of his first overseas trip to Europe. So yes, a lot of talk on intensive diplomacy. He did talk about vigorous competition. While we know he was talking about China, he said that competition does not mean confrontation. That's something that we heard from his press secretary, Jen Psaki, again alluding to China. Yeah, he talks about the Cold War because, you know, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres mentioned that term when he met with Joe Biden on Monday. He said that the tension in the region should not result in a Cold War scenario, which alludes to the fact of how tense the situation in the Indo-Pacific region is. But he also delivered this speech at a time when he's somewhat facing his own international credibility issue. You know, it was just a few weeks back when he had this faulty withdrawal from Afghanistan on the one hand, and now he sort of made this questionable deal. This is something that France might tell you it's questionable, with Australia and the UK on the submarine deal, and sort of looking and recalibrating its alliances in the Indo-Pacific region and alienating a traditional ally like France on the one hand, and trying to see how relationship with Europe is going to progress. And then on the other hand, you know, you sort of want to see how America is going to move forward in its counterterrorism measures as well, because NATO sort of, while it agreed that it should withdraw from Afghanistan, it has been no secret that it did not agree with the manner that it withdrew. And again, while the president did pat himself on the back for being the first U.S. president after 20 years of ending the war in Afghanistan and standing behind that podium, the irony cannot be lost that it's, again, just a few weeks ago, he talked about how, you know, this is not the world of 9/11. The U.S. is not the world of 9/11. Counterterrorism measures are stronger, but there was a drone strike that mistakenly killed innocent Afghans instead of an ISIS-K terrorist in Afghanistan as part of his new counterterrorism strategy. So these are all of the backdrops of where the speech really came from. But yes, in terms of words, in terms of setting the stage for his foreign policy, it was very familiar. It was a multilateral, it was an invitation to multilateralism and alliance. We'll have to see whether his actions match his words or not. Skeptics will tell you the fact that he was in and out of New York and didn't seize the opportunity to meet with more world leaders while he was here at the United Nations sort of indicates the fact that he might continue to move towards going at it alone a little more than not, a little more than perhaps, you know, world leaders would like.
Right. Stay with me, Susan. Let's also give our viewers a broader sense of the other issues that Joe Biden touched upon as a part of his maiden UN General Assembly address, promising relentless diplomacy. The U.S. president mapped out a new era of vigorous competition with new commitments to cope with climate change and the COVID-19 crisis. In his debut UNGA address, Joe Biden says the U.S. was back at the table in international forums. Biden added that the world is facing a decisive decade, addressing a variety of issues like the pandemic, climate change, and cyber threats.
We're back at the table in international forums, especially the United Nations, to focus attention and to spur global action on shared challenges. We are re-engaged at the World Health Organization and working in close partnership with COVAX to deliver life-saving vaccines around the world. We rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're running to retake a seat in the Human Rights Council next year at the UN. And as the United States seeks to rally the world to action, we will lead not just with the example of our power, but, God willing, with the power of our example.
The president also appealed to UNGA delegates for action on climate change, saying that the current situation is a code red for humanity. Biden added that the world is fast approaching a point of no return with regards to extreme weather events that are taking lives and costing billions of dollars.
In April, I announced the United States will double our public international financing to help developing nations tackle the climate crisis. And today, I'm proud to announce that we'll work with the Congress to double that number again, including for adaptation efforts. This will make the United States a leader in public climate finance.
Going back across to our correspondent Susan Tehrani. Susan, Joe Biden has pledged to double the USA to fight climate change. But let's just also talk about whether or not Joe Biden's claims of being a leader when it comes to fighting climate change do indeed hold any water when it comes to the fight against the climate crisis. America has absolutely not done a splendid job.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it, and then another aspect of it is it's really having a lot of problems here at the United Nations to create enthusiasm and support to really reach its climate agenda at the end of this conference, something that Antonio Guterres and member states here have made a cornerstone of UNGA 76. And one of those reasons is because of the adversary that it has with China. So whether or not, the United States, first of all, it's not meeting its climate requirements on the one hand, but then whether or not it's going to come out with some sort of even framework or agreement at the end of this meeting is also yet to be seen. But I do want to allude, because you played that soundbite of him sort of saying that, we're back at the table at the UN. He talked about re-engaging at the WHO and rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Those were really stabs at his predecessor, Donald Trump, for sort of taking a back seat from the United Nations and pulling the U.S. out of these accords. But as you mentioned, simply joining the Paris Accord or coming back at the UN for skeptics may not be enough for Joe Biden to say that just because he's not Trump and rejoins these efforts, really those benchmarks on climate and other issues will be met.
Susan Tehrani, leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for those updates for now. And as France's relations with the U.S. take an uncertain turn, French President Emmanuel Macron called up Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi today and discussed Indo-Pacific cooperation between the two countries. The two leaders reaffirmed their common will to act jointly in an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific area within the framework of the Euro-Indian relationship. France said that this approach aims to promote regional stability and the rule of law while ruling out any form of hegemony. Prime Minister Modi also tweeted about the talks, where he said, spoke with my friend President Emmanuel Macron on the situation in Afghanistan. We also discussed closer collaboration between India and France in the Indo-Pacific. We place great value in our strategic partnership with France, including in the UNSC. During the phone call, Macron recalled France's commitment to contribute to strengthening India's strategic autonomy, including its industrial and technological base. All of this within the framework of a close relationship, the one based on trust and mutual respect between two strategic partners. The India-France talks coming at an interesting time. France is currently locked in a diplomatic tussle with the US, Australia and the UK over the AUKUS deal. The AUKUS deal is a strategic trilateral between the three countries, where the US will provide 8 nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in a bid to strengthen their naval power in the Indo-Pacific and to counter China's growing influence. Just a few hours before the AUKUS partnership was announced, Australia cancelled a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with France, resulting in anger and frustration from Paris. France even called this deal a stab in the back and said that Australia will regret its move. Apart from the Indo-Pacific, Modi and Macron also discussed other pressing global issues like the situation in Afghanistan, a looming global terror threat with the Taliban in power. The two leaders also agreed to hold regular discussions on climate change and to continue their joint actions against the COVID-19 pandemic. During the talks, France also welcomed India's decision to resume its vaccine deliveries to the UN's COVAX program. And on the sidelines of the UNGA, the Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar held key bilateral meetings with the leaders of various countries. First and the most crucial, S. Jaishankar met with his French counterpart, where the two leaders discussed pressing regional issues, the key highlights being Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, of course, and the developments overall in the Indo-Pacific region. The bilateral comes at a time when France is at loggerheads with the US, the UK and Australia over the recently announced AUKUS deal, miffed with its ally Australia. France has lately reached out to India and promised its support to strengthen New Delhi's strategic autonomy. Jaishankar next met with the Foreign Minister of Iran. Tweeting about the bilateral, the Indian External Affairs Minister said, "Good to meet Hossein Amir Abdullahian of Iran again. Continued our conversation on strengthening bilateral cooperation. Meeting reaffirmed our convergence on regional issues." And let's go straight across now to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, with us for more on these developments. Siddhant, the very fact that France reached out to India, Emmanuel Macron calling up the Indian Prime Minister and having that conversation just days after the friction caused by the AUKUS agreement is a very telling sign of where the India-France partnership is headed.
Well, yes, of course, it's an important conversation which has happened between the Indian Prime Minister and the French President, largely a reaffirmation of the relationship and the fact that the French side has reaffirmed that when it comes to Indo-Pacific, that remains a priority for them. This, of course, coming amidst the AUKUS pact, but largely India-France relationship is a very multifaceted relationship which has defense as one of its key pillars. But the shadow of AUKUS would largely fall on the trilateral between France, Australia and India. The trilateral that has progressively grown from official level to, of course, the foreign ministers level, and then, of course, the leaders level that was expected to happen on the sidelines of the G20 meeting that will take place in Italy next month. So largely AUKUS deal has had a negative impact when it comes to bilateral relationship between Australia and France, because France, of course, is miffed because of this entire pact. But Australians kept the Indian side in the loop regarding the entire AUKUS pact, and the Australian Prime Minister, in fact, had spoken to the Indian Prime Minister. The Foreign and Defence Minister of both the countries had also spoken to their to the Indian side, and the focus, of course, is that how Quad and the Indo-Pacific, the vision of the Indo-Pacific can be focused on how there can be convergences when it comes to various issues in the region, whether it's climate change issue, whether it is the disaster issue, whether it is the COVID crisis issue.
Siddhant Sibal, thanks very much for those updates. With that, we're out of time in this edition. We're taking a very short break, but lots more coming up on the other side. Stay tuned.
The Chinese regime is using.
We were on top of the China story.
Distressing scenes at the top 2
We were on top of the Afghanistan story.
by the military.
A coalition of.
We have simplified the complex Indo-Pacific equation for you. The stage is now set for the next step. Will the world isolate China?
World leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. WION is in the U.S. Capitol to tell you where that's headed. A 10-day global coverage from the United States of America. Stay tuned to WION USA Direct. world is finally coming together against China. It's all happening right here in Washington, D.C., the first ever in-person Quad Summit and the Modi-Biden bilateral. All of this week, Gravitas will be coming live to you, first from Washington, D.C. and then from New York. This week will be a game changer for the Indo-Pacific and the world beyond. Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas US edition.
It all began here. A journey that shaped Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A movement to stand for what is right. Over a century later, on his birth anniversary, India's only international channel is here in South Africa.
Today it has engulfed the entire country. Business owners are complaining of financial...
Going behind the headlines to bring you reports from the heart of the nation. Now available in South Africa on DSTV from October 2nd.
World leaders converge in the Big Apple. A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. Follow me, Susan Tehrani, as I report live from the heart of all the diplomatic action. Chasing the biggest story in the world. WION-USA Direct live from September 20th to 30th.
It all began here. A journey that shaped Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A movement to stand for what is right. Over a century later, on his birth anniversary, India's only international channel is here in South Africa.
Today it has engulfed the entire country. Business owners are complaining of financial...
Going behind the headlines to bring you reports from the heart of the nation. Now available in South Africa on DSTV from October 2nd.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is all set to visit United States. On the agenda will be his bilateral with US President Joe Biden, participation at the first in-person Quad meeting, and his address at the United Nations General Assembly. Above all, the big focus will be on charting new geopolitics amidst a changing world, about celebration of India-US relationship billed as the most consequential relationship of this century. Follow me, Siddhant Sibal, for all the live and latest updates of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Washington and New York visit, only on WION.
Welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us here on WION World is One. You're watching the latest coming in from around the world with me, Molly Gambhir. A quick check on the top stories coming in at this hour.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. Advance human dignity around the world.
Delivering his maiden speech at the UN General Assembly, President Joe Biden, in a reference to relations with China, says the US does not seek a Cold War as he vows to stand up for friends and allies. UN Chief Antonio Guterres laments vaccine inequity across the world, says while some countries continue to have surplus jabs, many countries are witnessing empty shelves. 90% of African countries are still waiting for vaccines. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron hold talks. The two leaders discuss issues related to the Indo-Pacific region as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion French submarine order. Friction between US, Australia and European countries over the AUKUS partnership escalates. Germany slams Australia over ditching the submarine contract with France, says it will be difficult to rebuild trust. Special representatives of Russia, China and Pakistan collectively call on Taliban's Prime Minister and at the presidential palace in Kabul. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The United Nations voices deep concern at mass U.S. deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the U.S. moves about 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. At a time when the American president was preparing for his debut address at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, the foreign minister of the European Union held a closed-door meeting in the same city. The meeting was held on the Australia-France submarine deal worth $40 billion, which was scrapped by Australia in favor of the newly formed AUKUS alliance. Australia pulled out from the submarine deal with France and signed a new nuclear-powered submarine deal with the US and the UK. After meeting, the European foreign minister expressed solidarity with France, while France called Australia's actions a serious breach of trust.
Inside the Council, and my duty is explain what has happened inside the Council, the position has been this clear expression of solidarity with France and the consideration that this was not a bilateral issue but a relationship with the European Union that affects all of us, and also the fact that it doesn't go in the direction of a greater cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which is our purpose.
Of course, I have a great understanding for the disappointment of our French partners, and we are also in close exchange. It is once again a wake-up call for all of us in the European Union to ask ourselves how we can strengthen our sovereignty, how we can present a united front even on issues relevant to foreign and security policy, and how we can also put our economic weight and our political weight in the balance in such a way that we can contribute to security, bilateralism, and so that our values are also firmly anchored on the global level.
The first discussions between foreign ministers, Minister Le Drian and Josep Borrell, were very positive, in the sense that European solidarity and the support for France were extremely clear. There is a serious breach of trust and therefore we cannot pretend that nothing has happened. So we must keep all options on the table. Absolutely.
The European Union is keenly watching every development and listening to every message coming in from the Biden administration. While President Biden did mention standing by his allies, it will take a lot more than that to soothe the frayed ties. Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent Giles Gibson, who joined us from Brussels. Take a look.
We've seen the French in particular pushing back very strongly against the AUKUS deal, the French recalling their ambassador to Washington as a way of signalling their fury. We've also seen the European Commission and the European Union really lining up behind France in that entire dispute. But listening to this speech, you did hear some echoes of what European leaders have been saying in recent days about climate change. We saw President Biden, of course, no surprise there, talking a lot about climate change, saying that it is a borderless climate crisis, really sending this message that it's not up to individual countries to fight this crisis, but that there has to be universal action, that countries have to get together to fight climate change. And I was covering last week the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, to the European Parliament down in Strasbourg. And we saw a very similar message from her, talking about how the world needs to get together to fight climate change. And just like Joe Biden as well, we saw Ursula von der Leyen throwing it forward to that COP26 United Nations Climate Change Conference that's coming up in just a couple of months' time in Glasgow in the UK. So we saw Joe Biden, in the same way that we saw Ursula von der Leyen do in her speech last week, really putting the pressure on world leaders to get ready for that crucial conference that's coming up in November.
The United Nations General Assembly kickstarts with powerful speeches, fresh agendas ranging from COVID-19 to the climate crisis. A lot was in store as world leaders converged on the UN headquarters after more than a year. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro became the first world leader to address the UNGA. It was a much anticipated speech. A defiant Bolsonaro refused to get vaccinated against COVID-19, effectively challenging the UN honor system. It did not come as a surprise when the Brazilian leader touted early COVID-19 treatment over vaccines. Bolsonaro has been facing the heat for his handling of the COVID-19 crisis and for undermining the coronavirus. Remember, Brazil has the second highest COVID-19 death toll in the world after America.
We support vaccination efforts. However, my administration has not supported a vaccine or health passport or any other vaccine-related obligation. Since the pandemic started, we have supported doctors' professional autonomy in the quest for early treatment measures, in line with recommendations issued by the Brazilian Federal Council of Medicine. I myself underwent early treatment for COVID. We, of course, respect the professional doctor-patient relations as regards decisions on the proper medication to be used and also the potential for off-label use. We cannot understand why many countries, together with a large portion of the media, took a stance against early treatment measures. History and science will certainly be wise enough to hold everyone accountable.
And from the COVID-19 crisis, that address shifted to the environment, another issue for which Bolsonaro has been severely criticized. Brazil has been blessed with natural resources. In fact, the country is home to the vast majority of the world's largest rainforest, the Amazon. But of late, the region has been battling deforestation, wildfires and mining. Activists blame Bolsonaro's policies, but the Brazilian leader remained defiant on the world stage. He said that Brazil has the world's best environmental laws and even invited world leaders to visit the Amazon.
Human resources and funding allocated to strengthen environmental institutions have been doubled with a view to totally eliminating illegal deforestation. And the results of this important initiative are already visible. in the Amazon region, we have seen a drop of 32% in deforestation in August as compared to August last year. What other country in the world has an environmental preservation policy like ours? Ladies and gentlemen, you are all invited to come and visit our Amazon. Brazil today is already an example in energy generation. 83% of our energy comes from renewable sources.
Secretary General Antonio Guterres graded the world's vaccine rollout, calling out the inequitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. The UN chief called the rollout an obscenity.
On the one hand, we see the vaccines developed in record time, a victory of science and human ingenuity. On the other hand, we see that triumph undone by the tragedy of lack of political will, selfishness and mistrust. A surplus in some countries, empty shelves in others. A majority of the wealthier world vaccinated, over 90% of Africans still waiting for the first dose. This is a moral indictment of the state of our world. It is an obscenity. We passed the science test, but we are getting an F in ethics.
Guterres added that the pandemic and the climate crisis exposed profound fragilities in the society. The UN chief urged world leaders to bridge 6 great divides, promote peace and end conflicts, restore trust between the richer North and developing South on tackling global warming, reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, promote gender equality, ensure that half of humanity that has no access to the internet is connected by 2030, and tackle the generational divide by giving young people a seat at the table.
COVID and the climate crisis have exposed profound fragilities as societies and as a planet. Yet, instead of humility in the face of these epic challenges, we see hubris. Instead of the path of solidarity, we are on a dead end to destruction.
Guterres further warned that divisions between the US and China have echoes of the Cold War, calling for dialogue between the two sides.
It will be impossible to address dramatic economic and developed challenges while the world's 2 largest economies are at odds with each other. Yet I fear our world is creeping towards 2 different sets of economic, trade, financial and technological rules, 2 divergent approaches in the development of artificial intelligence, and ultimately the risk of 2 different military and geopolitical strategies.
On to India now. It has been touted as one of the biggest drug haul busts in the country. The anti-smuggling intelligence officials have seized nearly 3 tons of heroin in the state of Gujarat. The 2 consignments marked as carrying talcum powder were seized at the Mundra port. Forensic testing is underway to determine the exact value of the seized drugs, but it has been reported to be worth nearly $2.7 billion. 2 people have been arrested. Several others are being investigated. The investigation report suggests the involvement of Afghan nationals behind the drug haul, although no one else has been arrested yet. Now, as per the Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, 2 consignments originated from Afghanistan. 1 container was carrying nearly 2,000 kilograms of heroin, and the other one had 1,000 kilograms. These containers reached the Bandar Abbas port in Iran and were marked as semi-processed talc stones before being shipped to India's Mundra port in Gujarat. The Indian authorities had received intel reports on the potential narcotics smuggling. Even though no foreign arrests have been made yet, the officials have confirmed that Afghan nationals are involved, and there's more. On the 11th of July this year, just over 2 months back, a strikingly similar drug haul was busted in the western port of Mumbai. Over 350 kilograms of heroin was recovered, which was worth more than $300 million. And 4 men were arrested, including Afghan nationals. Is this a coincidence? We think it's a pattern. Afghanistan is the world's biggest producer of heroin, which is derived from opium poppy cultivation. And the Taliban controls the biggest drug trade racket in the world. They, in fact, make up for 80 to 90% of the global output. Take a look at this report. Between 2019 and 2020, the opium production in Afghanistan faced a massive growth of 37%, which also explains the Taliban's rapid rise to power. A huge portion of the Taliban's operation budget comes from drugs, specifically opium. And the total value of poppy cultivation in just 2020 was $350 million. Since the invasion in 2001, America tried to strangle this trade with another war on drugs. But much like their military operation, this one was also half-baked. The Taliban continued to export heroin behind the shadows and extended their trade network for 20 years. And now the Taliban are reviving the old drug routes. Many of them go through India. In the last couple of months, Indian officials have nabbed multiple drug mules at airports, all carrying high-quality heroin. These mules were possibly headed for the West, to the US, Europe, Australia and elsewhere. The drug traders always take long, confusing routes to throw governments off their scent. Their usual stops include Pakistan's southwest coast, Mozambique, Johannesburg, Doha and India before dumping these drugs in the West. On record, the Taliban have consistently maintained that they are not involved in the narcotics trade. They take pride in the opium ban. In the year 2000 and 2021, millions of dollars have been invested by the international community and the United Nations to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a narco state. But in reality, Afghanistan has always been a narco state, just like the Taliban were never eliminated. Let's now shift our focus to Australia, where the koala population has been declining, so much so that a new report reveals that 30% of the country's koalas disappeared in just the last 3 years. This is a very worrying development. Koalas are native to Australia, and if the trend continues, then they will go extinct. Environmentalists have been asking the authorities to protect the koalas' natural habitats, which have been destroyed by frequent bushfires and drought conditions. Remember, several koalas were killed when bushfires ravaged Australia's New South Wales state in 2018. Water scarcity is also threatening the koalas. The animal is heavily dependent on water. Experts are saying that it is high time that Australia rolls out a koala protection law.
41% in New South Wales is predictable, isn't it, because of the bushfires? There was a huge amount of... But interestingly enough, some of those habitats were empty anyway, so it's not like the koala numbers dropped. What we're concerned about is places like Western New South Wales, where the drought over the last 10 years has just had this cumulative effect. River systems completely dry for years. River red gums, which are the lifeblood of koalas, dead.
The sudden death of 63 endangered penguins on a Cape Town beach rocked South Africa. Nearly a week later, experts have found the cause behind the mass deaths. And it may sound bizarre, the penguins were killed by honey bees. Autopsies have revealed that the penguins had multiple bee stings. Toxicology tests have also confirmed the same. Apart from this, many dead bees were found at the site where the birds' bodies were found.
And our researcher and our veterinarian here on site started the postmortems to look what might have killed the birds. And after doing several birds, they actually discovered that the birds in their bare patches that they have over their eyes, that they had little stings, basically bee stings in their eyes. And then our veterinarian actually went back to site and found dead bees on that stretch of beach.
The incident has shocked conservationists who have been working round the clock to save the endangered penguins. What led to the bee attacks? Experts say it was a freak incident. They say the group of penguins might have approached a beehive and the insects perceived them as a threat.
We have never seen an attack of bees on African penguins, or actually I think on any penguin species. So this is a complete freak accident. We suspect that it's just basically bad luck for the penguins. We don't expect this to happen more often, or that the bees start being a threat to the penguins.
Let's now tell you more about this killer Cape honeybee. It's a subspecies of the European honeybee and is native to South Africa's Western Cape region. Cape honeybee colonies grow faster and they are known to be more ferocious than other bees. Cape bees often attack in groups. Let's now take a quick look at what's making news in the world of business. The American credit rating agency Standard & Poor's has said the Chinese government is not likely to give direct support to debt-ridden developer China Evergrande Group. S&P believes that the Chinese banking sector can digest Evergrande's billions of dollars of default with slight disruption. With over $300 billion of debt, S&P says Evergrande is likely to miss a number of interest payments. Shares of Evergrande in Hong Kong today fell as much as 4%. The American multinational investment bank Goldman Sachs, meanwhile, is doubling down on valuation of Indian markets as stocks across categories have been getting heavy inflow of money. Goldman Sachs says the Indian indices could cross $5 trillion in valuation from the current $3.5 trillion within 3 years, which would place it at 5th place in the world. According to Goldman Sachs, India's share in the global stock market value expected to rise from the current 2.8% to 3.7% over the next 5 years. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and online retail giant Amazon's founder Jeff Bezos discussed the issue of taxation in New York on the sidelines of the UNGA meeting. The British Prime Minister has raised the issue of taxation and hoped progress in line with recently implemented global minimum corporate tax. The UK was a strong advocate of the global deal on a minimum corporate tax rate clinched by the G7 countries in June this year. According to Amazon, $670 million in taxes had been paid last year on revenues of around $28 billion. With that, it's a wrap on this edition. We are taking a very short break, but lots more coming up on the other side. Stay tuned.
The Chinese regime is...
We were on top of the China story.
Distressing scenes at the Khartoum.
We were on top of the Afghanistan story.
By the
a coalition of...
We have simplified the complex Indo-Pacific equation for you. The stage is now set for the next step. Will the world isolate China?
World leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. WION is in the U.S. Capitol to tell you where that's headed. A 10-day global coverage from the United States of America. Stay tuned to WION USA Direct.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is all set to visit United States. On the agenda will be his bilateral with US President Joe Biden, participation at the first in-person Quad meeting, and his address at the United Nations General Assembly. Above all, the big focus will be on charting new geopolitics amidst a changing world, about celebration of India-US relationship billed as the most consequential relationship of this century. Follow me, Siddhant Sibal, for all the live and latest updates of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Washington and New York visit, only on WION.
One World Trade Center that is the one where the impact.
The cause of India's freedom for many years.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
America is a constant work in progress.
The world is finally coming together against China. It's all happening right here in Washington, D.C., the first ever in-person Quad summit and the Modi-Biden bilateral. All of this week, Gravitas will be coming live to you, first from Washington, D.C. and then from New York. This week will be a game changer for the Indo-Pacific and the world beyond. Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas US edition.
World leaders converge in the Big Apple. A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. Follow me, Susan Tehrani, as I report live from the heart of all the diplomatic action. Chasing the biggest story in the world. WION-USA Direct, live from September 20th to 30th.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views, and analysis. WIONnews.com. World is one.
From our studios live in New York City, I'm Susan Tehrani.
People from many different countries, some who have been in America for generations, others who are more newly arrived.
So what Joe Biden has tried to do is definitely try to frame the election as a referendum.
The US president even called President Erdogan an autocrat.
Hello, I'm Jodie Cohen, broadcasting from Jerusalem.
Israel might be on the verge of getting a new government.
Climate change will, for the first time, be an issue of important discussion.
Child labour increases for the first time in 2 decades, according to the UN.
To strengthen the alliance, boosting its defence capabilities and focusing on that.
Coronavirus cases are surging in Moscow.
There is a sense that authorities are beginning to run out of ideas.
The second and third waves of COVID-19 hit Europe very, very hard.
Tokyo's 7-day average has actually fallen. Over a week ago, it was over 800 new cases a day.
200 community drugstores due to be included over the next 2 weeks.
You're watching WION World is One with me, Alison Lagrange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa.
President Muhammadu Buhari says this latest attack on school children will be the last to occur in Nigeria.
It doesn't matter who is looking for power now, but the fact that it's now going more on attracting humanitarian issues.
You're watching WION News, coming to you live from Nairobi, Kenya.
I'm Redi Francis, coming to you live for this newscast from Beirut, Lebanon.
It's a huge blow for what remains of the pro-democracy movement here in Hong Kong.
Chinese regime is using.
We were on top of the China story.
Distressing scenes at the Khartoum.
We were on top of the Afghanistan story.
By the
A coalition of.
We have simplified the complex Indo-Pacific equation for you. The stage is now set for the next step. Will the world isolate China?
World leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. WION is in the U.S. Capitol to tell you where that's headed. A 10-day global coverage from the United States of America. Stay tuned to WION USA Direct.
Welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us here on WION World is One. My name is Molly Gambhir. As we continue to dissect the key takeaways from the United Nations General Assembly session, a quick check on the top stories making headlines.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. Advance human dignity.
Delivering his maiden speech at the UNGA, President Joe Biden, in a reference to relations with China, says the U.S. does not seek a Cold War as he vows to stand up for friends and allies. UN Chief Antonio Guterres laments vaccine inequity across the world, says while some countries continue to have surplus jabs, many countries are witnessing empty shelves. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron hold talks. The two leaders discuss issues related to the Indo-Pacific region as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion French submarine order. Friction between the US, Australia and European countries over the AUKUS partnership grows. Germany slams Australia over ditching the submarine contract with France, says it will be difficult to rebuild trust. Special representatives of Russia, China and Pakistan collectively call on the Taliban's Prime Minister Hassan Akhund at the presidential palace in Kabul. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The United Nations voices deep concern at mass U.S. deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the U.S. moves about 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas.
World leaders converge in the Big Apple. A gripping week of diplomacy, drama, and some fun moments. Follow me, Susan Tehrani, as I report live from the heart of all the diplomatic action. Chasing the biggest story in the world. WION-USA Direct live from September 20th to 30th.
Almost a fortnight after America's mismanaged withdrawal from Afghanistan, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has defended Biden's decision. Defending the withdrawal of the US and allied forces from the country, Johnson said they knew it was not going to be very easy, but there was no way they could keep running another country as proxy.
It's never going to be an easy thing to do to pull out of somewhere like Afghanistan after 20 years in a clean and straightforward way. But you can't spend your whole time trying to run another country by proxy.
The British Prime Minister called the operation a massive logistical success and expressed gratitude towards the US military, to whom the UK owes a debt.
My country, the UK, owes a big debt to the US military for the incredible professionalism and sacrifice.
On being asked about the future of 3.6 million women left to their fate as the Taliban has brought back its regressive policies with an iron fist, the UK Prime Minister said this.
It's a terrible thing now to listen to some of the threats that we're hearing to their potential, their freedom, their opportunities. But what we've got to do is work together as the West to say to the new authorities in Afghanistan, in Kabul, look, you want our cash, we want to engage with you, but Afghanistan can't be a breeding ground for terror anymore.
The British government has faced a lot of heat over its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, from allegations of botched-up evacuations to leaving behind their embassy guards in Kabul. The entire withdrawal process landed the Johnson administration in a soup, so much so that it led to the foreign minister's withdrawal from office. Johnson is set to meet U.S. President Joe Biden on the sidelines of the UNGA. Security, climate and economic agenda are likely to be on the top of the agenda. This is in the run-up to Britain hosting a major environmental conference at the end of October. The contentious AUKUS deal and the SAARC ties with France are also likely to be discussed in the meeting. Facing intense heat from their allies, U.S. President Joe Biden and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison also met on the sidelines of the UNGA. Their meeting focused on the newly announced AUKUS deal. The two leaders pushed back against the deal's critics in Europe. Joe Biden emphasized on the need for a free and open Indo-Pacific. He said the meeting with Morrison would lay the groundwork for the big meeting on Friday, the first in-person Quad summit.
We have a big agenda to discuss today, starting with our partnership to advance our vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this conversation that we're going to continue with Japan, India on Friday, and the first in-person Quad leaders meeting. It's a historic event, and I think we're all looking forward to it.
Prime Minister Morrison outlined the shared tenets of the US-Australia partnership. He said the new alliance will guarantee global freedom and free navigation in the Indo-Pacific.
And the United States and Australia have always shared a partnership that is about a world order that favours freedom. And that's why we've always stood together. And in pursuing that freedom, it of course goes to our security interests. But more than that, it goes to global prosperity. It goes to global freedom, the freedom of our seas, the freedom of our region.
Both leaders were meeting for the first time since the announcement of the AUKUS alliance. The new military partnership has hogged headlines at the UN. France has recalled its ambassador in protest against it, and on Monday, the EU foreign ministers expressed full solidarity with Paris. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden made his debut at the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, his biggest international summit since the botched Afghan pullout. Joe Biden stressed on the fact that the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War, acknowledged the increasing concerns about the rising U.S.-China tensions. Listen to what he said.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure.
Biden also said that the U.S. will seek a return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, if Tehran does the same. Last week saw the minor breakthrough in the nuclear talks, with the UN atomic watchdog and Iran reaching an agreement to avert the nuclear deal crisis.
The United States remains committed to preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. We're working with the P5+1 to engage Iran diplomatically and to seek a return to JCPOA. We're prepared to return to full compliance if Iran does the same.
And as for South Korea, Joe Biden called for complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, calling for a plan to increase stability in the peninsula.
We seek serious and sustained diplomacy to pursue the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We seek concrete progress toward an available plan with tangible commitments that would increase stability on the peninsula and in the region, as well as improve the lives of the people in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
And Biden once again called for a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, saying it was the only way forward for peace in the region.
The commitment of the United States to Israel's security is without question And our support for an independent Jewish state is unequivocal. But I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign and democratic Palestinian state.
And spirituality, the land of perseverance and independence. The Iranian people are monotheist and patriotic. They have their unique identity and love to explore the world. For hundreds of years, our nation have safeguarded their right to self-determination and freedom against the hegemonists and have made their country the most progressive in the election-based political system in the west of Asia. The Islamic Revolution was indeed a great leap for the fulfillment of national and Islamic ideals of Iranians, including freedom, independence, and religious democracy. I, as the elected president of the great people of Iran, am honored to be their representative to convey to the world at large the message of rationality, justice, and freedom, which are the three most fundamental principles of the life of the contemporary man. However, those three principles that all the Abrahamic religions have in common would not be able to attain their purpose without spirituality. Freedom and justice as two sacred and innocent words that are too broad to define are indeed very tough and intricate when it comes to practicing them. Freedom means the right to think, decide, and act for all the human beings. Peace and lasting security are tied to the administration of justice. And basically, the divine prophets emerged so that people would demand justice and exercise their rights. Justice and freedom may be achieved only when the rights of all nations are fulfilled. As a matter of fact, any violation of the rights of nations will more than anything endanger global peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, this year, two scenes made history. One was on January the 6th, when the US Congress was attacked by the people, and two, when the people of Afghanistan were dropped down from the US planes in August. From the capital to Kabul, one clear message was sent to the world. The United States hegemonic system has no credibility, whether inside or outside the country. What is seen in our region today proves that not only the hegemonist and the idea of hegemony, but also the project of imposing westernized identity have failed miserably. The result of seeking hegemony has been blood spilling and instability and ultimately defeat and escape. Today, the US does not get to exit Iraq and Afghanistan, but is expelled. And at the same time, it is the oppressed people from Palestine and Syria to Yemen and Afghanistan, as well as the US taxpayers who have to pay for this lack of rationality. Today, the world doesn't care about America first or America is back. If rationality prevails in the minds of the decision makers, they have to realize that nations' perseverance is stronger than the power of the superpowers. Over the past decade, the US has been making the mistake of modifying its way of war with the world instead of changing its way of life. An erroneous path cannot be brought to fruition by merely adopting a different method. Sanctions are the US new way of war with the nations of the world. Sanctions against the Iranian nation started not with my country's nuclear program. They even predate the Islamic Revolution and go back to the year 1951 when oil nationalization went underway in Iran, which in turn led to a military coup backed by the Americans and the Britons against the then government of Iran, which had been elected by the people. Sanctions, and especially sanctions on medicine at the time of COVID-19 pandemic, are crimes against humanity. The Holy Quran introduces the destruction of nature and mankind as a major characteristic of the tyrants. The Islamic Republic of Iran proposes that any kind of sanction-induced restriction or disruption in the supply of good health and environment as to humanitarian issues be declared forbidden. Moreover, I, on behalf of the Iranian nation and millions of refugees hosted by my country, would like to condemn the continued illegal US sanctions, especially in the area of humanitarian items, and demand that this organized crime against humanity be recorded as a symbol and reality of the so-called American human rights. Despite the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran was keen from the outset to purchase and import COVID-19 vaccines from reliable international sources, it faced inhumane medical sanctions. Therefore, from the very beginning, we started to sustainably produce vaccines domestically. In addition to peaceful nuclear and satellite technologies, Iran is the medical hub of the region, and numerous Iranian physicians and scientists such as Avicenna shine in the history of humankind. Knowledge that is beneficial to humanity cannot be sanctioned. We ourselves have been able to produce fuel for the Tehran research reactor, which makes radiopharmaceuticals for more than 1 million cancer patients in Iran. We have also made astonishing progress in the area of biotechnology and stem cells in spite of all sanctions. And today, despite all sanctions targeting human rights, we have become one of the manufacturers of COVID-19 vaccines. Cooperation amongst the countries of the world in the realm of health, and especially on vaccines, is tantamount to helping the spirit of humanity and the policy based on divinity, humanity, and international relations. Coronavirus is a wake-up call for the whole world, reminding us once again that the security of all human beings are interdependent. Crises in the human societies such as violence, poverty, unemployment, moral and economic corruption, collapse of family foundations, regional wars, organized terrorism, and environmental crises are all the results of inattention to the principles of rationality, justice, and freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, the strategic thoughts of the Islamic Republic of Iran are rooted in the ideas of the founder of the Islamic Revolution, the late Imam Khomeini, may his soul rest in peace, as well as in the genuine concepts of true Islam, that is, rationality, prudence, and pondering, and have resulted in the resistance in line with the national interests of countries. Speaking about the rights of nations without speaking of the obligations of the governments cannot bring about the fulfillment of the rights, as the independence of a nation is its freedom. The Islamic Revolution supports this kind of freedom and hence obstructs extremism. And this is the nature of the true strength of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which does good to all. The Islamic Republic of Iran is inspiring, and as such, the power emanating from it creates security. The security-making model of the Islamic Republic of Iran is based on forming intra-regional mechanisms through diplomacy that is pivoted on and free from outside interferences. It has been our policy to strive for the preservation of stability and territorial integrity of all the countries of the region, if not for the power and role of Iran alongside the governments and peoples of Syria and Iraq, as well as the selfless efforts of martyrs Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and General Qasem Soleimani. Today, ISIS would be the Mediterranean neighbors of Europe. And of course, ISIS will not be the last wave of extremism. The new drive to come up with the Cold War-esque divisions will not help foster the security of humans by isolating independent countries. An arbitrary attitude is not the way to solve terrorism, because terrorism has its roots in various crises such as identity and economy. The fact that modern lives have become devoid of meaning and spirituality, as well as the spread of poverty, discrimination, and oppression, have helped the rise of terrorism. The increasing growth of indigenous terrorism in the West bears witness to this bitter truth. Even more bitter is the use of terrorism as an instrument for foreign policy, because you cannot fight terrorism with double standards. You cannot make a terrorist group such as ISIS in a certain place and claim to fight it somewhere else. After first seeking the grace of the Almighty God, the solution to skirmishes and conflicts in our region lies in the following: making the will of nations rule over their own destiny by referring to the results of public vote. But in order for this to materialize, two basic preconditions need be met. One, halting the aggressions of the outsiders and occupation, and two, the sincere cooperation of governments to counter terrorism. The military presence of the United States in Syria and Iraq is the biggest hindrance to the establishment of democracy and will of nations. Freedom does not fit in the backpacks of soldiers coming from outside the region. If an inclusive government having an effective participation of all ethnicities shouldn't emerge to run Afghanistan, security will not be restored to the country. And like occupation, paternalism is also doomed to failure. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is very worrying, and the world needs to break its silence towards crimes against humanity. The solution? The speedy and unconditional stop to the Yemeni aggression, opening of channels for providing humanitarian aid, and facilitation of constructive talks between Yemeni groups. The occupier Zionist regime is the organizer of the biggest state terrorism, whose agenda is to slaughter women and children in Gaza and the West Bank. Today, an all-out blockade has turned Gaza to the biggest prison in the world. The so-called deal of the century failed, just like any other deal forced on Palestinians. There is only one solution: holding a referendum with the participation of all Palestinians, of all religions and ethnicities, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This solution was set forth by the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran many years ago, which is now registered as one of the official documents of the United Nations. Mr. Chairman, today the whole world, including the Americans themselves, have admitted that the project of countering the Iranian people, which manifested itself in the form of violating the JCPOA and was followed by the maximum pressure and arbitrary withdrawal from an internationally recognized agreement, has totally failed. However, the policy of maximum tyranny is still on. We want nothing more than what is rightfully ours. We demand the implementation of international rules. All parties must stay true to the nuclear deal and the UN resolution in practice. 15 reports released by the IAEA have attested to the adherence of Iran to its commitments. However, the United States has not yet discharged its obligation, which is lifting sanctions. It has encroached upon the agreement, withdrawn from it, and levied even more sanctions on my people. The United States mistakenly believed it would render us desperate and devastated, but our perseverance has yielded results and will always do. For the smart and dynamic resistance of the Islamic Republic of Iran comes from our strategic rationality, and we don't trust the promises made by the US government. It is the strategic policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to consider the production and stockpiling of atomic weapons as forbidden, and that based on the religious decree by His Eminence, the Supreme Leader. Nukes have no place in our defense doctrine and deterrence policy. The Islamic Republic considers useful the talks whose ultimate outcome is the lifting of all oppressive sanctions, while decisively defending all its rights and the interests of its people. Iran is keen to have large-scale political and economic cooperation and convergence with the rest of the world. I seek effective interaction with all the countries of the world, especially with our neighbors, and shake their hands warmly. A new era has begun. The Islamic Republic of Iran is ready to play its part for a better world. A world brimful of rationality, justice, freedom, morality, and spirituality. Thank you all for your attention. Peace and mercy of Allah be upon you.
Ibrahim Raisi slamming the United States on multiple fronts as a part of his address at the United Nations General Assembly. Talking about the Afghanistan pullout, US did not exit Kabul but were expelled from Afghanistan is what Ibrahim Raisi has said. Apart from that, also slamming America when it comes to its policy, the Israel-Palestine conflict, talking about how the American government has failed on multiple fronts on several promises that were made to the people of these regions as well. And the US hegemonic system, he says, has no credibility. At this point, we're taking a very short break. We're out of time in this edition, but that remains our top focus. Stay with us.
The Chinese regime is...
We were on top of the China story.
Distressing scenes at the Khartoum are...
We were on top of the Afghanistan story.
By the military.
A coalition of...
We have simplified the complex Indo-Pacific equation for you. The stage is now set for the next step. Will the world isolate China?
World leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. WION is in the U.S. Capitol to tell you where that's headed. A 10-day global coverage from the United States of America. Stay tuned to WION USA Direct. The world is finally coming together against China. It's all happening right here in Washington, D.C., the first ever in-person Quad Summit and the Modi-Biden bilateral. All of this week, Gravitas will be coming live to you, first from Washington, D.C. and then from New York. This week will be a game changer for the Indo-Pacific and the world beyond. Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas US edition.
We were on top of the China story.
Distressing scenes at the Khartoum are...
We were on top of the Afghanistan story.
By the military.
A coalition of...
We have simplified the complex Indo-Pacific equation for you. The stage is now set for the next step. Will the world isolate China?
World leaders are meeting here in Washington, D.C. WION is in the U.S. Capitol to tell you where that's headed. A 10-day global coverage from the United States of America. Stay tuned to WION USA Direct.
Welcome back. Thanks very much for staying on with us here on WION World is One. You're watching the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly with me, Molly Gambhir. A quick look at the top stories.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. Advance human dignity around us.
Delivering his maiden address at the UNGA, President Joe Biden, in a reference to relations with China, says the U.S. does not seek a Cold War as he vows to stand up for friends and allies. President Biden says the U.S. would return to the Iranian nuclear deal in full if Tehran does the same, as he urged world leaders to work together to address global challenges like climate change, pandemic, and terrorism. UN Chief Antonio Guterres laments vaccine inequity across the world, says while some countries continue to have surplus vaccines, many countries are witnessing empty shelves, 90% of African countries still waiting for vaccines. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron hold talks. The two leaders discuss issues related to the Indo-Pacific region as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion French submarine order. Friction between the US, Australia and the European countries over the AUKUS partnership grows. Germany slams Australia over ditching the submarine contract with France, says it will be difficult to rebuild trust. Special representatives of Russia, China and Pakistan collectively call on the Taliban's Prime Minister at the presidential palace in Kabul. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The United Nations voices deep concern over mass U.S. deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the U.S. moves about 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. Joe Biden, in his maiden UN General Assembly address, promised relentless diplomacy. The U.S. president mapped out a new era of vigorous competition with new commitments to cope with climate change and the COVID-19 crisis. In his debut UNGA address, Biden said that the U.S. was back at the table in international forums. Biden said that the world is facing a decisive decade, addressing a variety of issues like the pandemic, climate change, and cyber threats.
We're back at the table in international forums, especially the United Nations, to focus attention and to spur global action on shared challenges. We are re-engaged at the World Health Organization and working in close partnership with COVAX to deliver life-saving vaccines around the world. We rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're running to retake a seat in the Human Rights Council next year at the UN. And as the United States seeks to rally the world to action, we will lead not just with the example of our power, but, God willing, with the power of our example.
The president also appealed to the UNGA delegates for action on climate change, saying that the current situation is a code red for humanity. Biden added that the world is fast approaching a point of no return with regard to extreme weather events that are taking lives and costing billions of dollars.
In April, I announced the United States will double our public international financing to help developing nations tackle the climate crisis. And today, I'm proud to announce that we'll work with the Congress to double that number again including for adaptation efforts. This will make the United States a leader in public climate finance.
On the sidelines of the UNGA, meanwhile, the Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar held key bilateral meetings with leaders of various countries. First, and the most crucial, S. Jaishankar met with his French counterpart. The two leaders discussed pressing regional issues, the key highlights being Taliban-controlled Afghanistan and the developments in the Indo-Pacific region. The bilateral coming at a time when France is at loggerheads with the US, UK and Australia over the recently announced AUKUS deal. Miffed with its ally Australia, France has lately reached out to India and promised its support to strengthen New Delhi's strategic autonomy. S. Jaishankar next met with the Foreign Minister of Iran. Tweeting about that bilateral, the Indian External Affairs Minister said, "Good to meet Hossein Amir Abdullahian of Iran again." Continued our conversation on strengthening bilateral cooperation. Meeting reaffirmed our convergence on regional issues. Note here, S. Jaishankar was the first foreign minister to visit Iran when President Ibrahim Raisi took charge, and has consistently engaged with Iran on regional issues, especially with the Taliban now in power in Afghanistan. As the day went by, S. Jaishankar met with Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry. After the talks, Jaishankar posted a tweet that read, "Agreed to take forward our bilateral cooperation," exchanged views on Afghanistan as well. It's no doubt that all decisions, all discussions and bilaterals are taking place on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, having Afghanistan as the major talking point. The Taliban's return to power after the US announced its troop withdrawal is an issue that concerns the entire world. And now, with all American and NATO troops out from Afghan soil, the Taliban Afghanistan is feared to become a hotspot for terror planning and activities. The general debate of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, more than 100 heads of state, government attending in person. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to address his 5th UNGA session as the first speaker on the 25th of September. Let's take a look now at the Prime Minister's previous appearances at the UNGA.
After assuming office as the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi has travelled to the US every year, except in 2018 and 2020.
सर्वप्रथम मैं संयुक्त राष्ट्र
Prime Minister Modi gave his maiden address at the UNGA in 2014. Following the footsteps of BJP patriarch Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Prime Minister Modi delivered his UNGA speech in Hindi.
भारत के प्रधानमंत्री के रूप में बढ़ाने
His 35-minute address covered a number of subjects: terrorism, reforms of the United Nations, and the need for a more inclusive global development were the highlights of his speech. He also took a jab at Pakistan and said that India was prepared to engage in a serious bilateral dialogue with Pakistan in a peaceful atmosphere without the shadow of terrorism.
मैं पाकिस्तान से मित्रता और सहयोग बढ़ाने के लिए पूरी गंभीरता से शांतिपूर्ण वातावरण में बिना आतंक के साये के साथ द्विपक्षीय वार्ता करना चाहता हूं, लेकिन पाकिस्तान का भी यह दायित्व है कि उपयुक्त वातावरण बनाए और गंभीरता से द्विपक्षीय बातचीत के लिए सामने आए।
In 2015, PM Modi's key message to the UNGA was on climate change. Once again, Prime Minister Modi addressed the 193-member strong assembly in Hindi. He underlined how an industrializing India was also acting responsibly. Reiterating the slogan of climate justice, Modi told the Assembly that India was already on the way to implementing several of the Agenda 2030 goals. He called for more global emphasis and cooperation in developing renewable sources of energy through innovation, finance and technology.
क्लाइमेट चेंज की चुनौती से निपटने में उन समाधानों पर बल देने की आवश्यकता है जिनसे हम अपने उद्देश्यों को प्राप्त करने में सफल हो सके। हमें एक वैश्विक जन भागीदारी का निर्माण करना होगा जिसके बल पर टेक्नोलॉजी, इनोवेशन और फाइनेंस का उपयोग करते हुए हम क्लीन और रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी को सर्वसुलभ बना सके।
पाकिस्तान वालों, आपने क्या बनाया?
Over the next 3 years, from 2016 to 2018, former External Affairs Minister of India, Sushma Swaraj, addressed the annual gathering.
आपने आतंकवादी ठिकाने बनाए।
Prime Minister Modi's speech during the 74th UN General Assembly in 2019 was his first after winning a second term as Prime Minister in a resounding electoral victory. In a clear jab at Pakistan, Modi called for unanimity in combating terrorism and said the UN needed to adopt a new direction. While addressing the session, he described terrorism as one of the biggest challenges before humanity and emphasized the importance of the world standing as one against it.
हम मानते हैं कि ये किसी एक देश की नहीं बल्कि पूरी दुनिया की और मानवता की सबसे बड़ी चुनौतियों में से एक है। आतंक के नाम पर बटी हुई दुनिया उन सिद्धांतों को ठेस पहुंचाती है जिनके आधार पर यूएन का जन्म हुआ है और इसलिए मानवता की खातिर आतंक के खिलाफ पूरे विश्व का एकमत होना, एकजुट होना मैं अनिवार्य समझता हूं।
(2020's UNGA session was unlike any other before it. On account of the coronavirus pandemic, global leaders sent in pre-recorded video statements to the general debate of the 75th session of the UNGA. In his video statement, Modi called for major reforms to the United Nations. He criticized the international body for keeping India out of the decision-making structures of the UN. He also spoke about India's contributions over the centuries and during the pandemic.
संयुक्त राष्ट्र की प्रतिक्रियाओं में बदलाव, व्यवस्थाओं में बदलाव, स्वरूप में बदलाव आज समय की मांग है।
This year, Prime Minister Modi will address the 76th session of the UN General Assembly on the 25th of September as the first speaker of the day. Prime Minister Modi is expected to highlight the Afghan crisis after the Taliban takeover and the continuing threat posed by Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And the world's attention is on New York, where leaders have gathered for the 76th edition of the United Nations General Assembly session. On this year's agenda is the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Ironically, the first speaker at this year's UNGA session was Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who himself refused to get vaccinated. This by itself assures assures a lot of criticism that will be coming his way post his address. Let's take a look now at the past UNGA sessions and similar bizarre yet ironic moments that made global headlines.
What would you expect world leaders to do at the UNGA? Banging the shoe on the table would not be one of the choices. Yet it happened on the 12th of October 1960. Nikita Khrushchev, the then president of the Soviet Union, did exactly that. What made the former strongman of Soviet Union so angry? Philippines spoke about the atrocities of the communist dictatorship. But still, banging the shoe is taking it a bit too far. If Khrushchev chose to react to criticism in extreme fashion this millennium, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela set new benchmarks.
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí.
Yesterday the devil was here, right here.
En este mismo lugar.
It smells of sulfur, this podium from where I'm speaking. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, from this same place, the President of the United States, who I call the devil, came here speaking as the owner of the world.
Chavez, the then president of Venezuela, smelled sulfur because Bush, the devil, addressed the UN. Chavez also compared Bush's speech to Alfred Hitchcock's movies and gave a little title to Bush's speech, The Devil's Recipe. If Chavez called the former US President Bush devil, then Libya's former President Gaddafi termed the UN Security Council the Terror Council. That too, in his first appearance at the UN in 2009.
President of the Security Council is security feudalism, political feudalism, for those with permanent seats protected by them and used against us. It should be called not the Security Council, but the Terror Council.
Clearly, the General Assembly is a venue for controversial props. Just ask Benjamin Netanyahu, who illustrated the Iran nuclear threat. And this report won't be complete without Donald Trump.
Accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Should the General Assembly of United Nations be used to make such extreme remarks, statements that could jeopardize global peace? We leave that for you to ponder upon. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
In the latest from China's Evergrande financial crisis, the debt-laden property developers chairman said in a letter to the staff members today that the group is confident the company will walk out of its darkest moment. Before that, China Evergrande Group's debt crisis caused a sell-off in the Asian stock markets. However, European stocks traded higher, bouncing back from the concerns about default of Chinese property developer. The Pan-European Stocks 600 index was trading 1.1% higher by mid-morning, with all sectors in positive territory. Earlier today, in the major Asian markets except India, reacted to the concerns of Evergrande contagion spreading to other markets. There are growing risks the property giant Evergrande could default on its massive debt, prompting investors to flee riskier assets. Selling pressure persisted in early trade in Asia ahead of a major test for Evergrande this week, which is due to pay $83.5 million in interest relating to its March 2022 bond on Thursday. It has another $47.5 million payment due on the 29th of September for March 2024 notes. Both bonds would default if Evergrande fails to settle the interest within 30 days of the scheduled payment dates. The Evergrande crisis is being called a $300 billion debt bomb for the world's second largest economy, where the crises of this magnitude are rarely visible. Evergrande is on the verge of defaulting on massive interest payments on loans and bonds, employs 200,000 people, and has presence in more than 280 cities. It has an electric car unit as well as investments in tourism, digital operations, insurance, health. Regulators have warned that its huge liabilities could spark broader risks for China's financial system if its debts are not stabilized. Investors also fear troubles at China's property sector, one of the key engines of the country's stellar economic growth over decades. It could have ripple effects across the global economy.
If they totally just let accordingly hands off, that means they allow the bonds to actually default, that could actually lead to a social problem. Because do not forget over here is that they have this Evergrande itself also sold numerous amount of wealth management products to the retail investors, which at the end of the day, I do not think the Chinese authority want to have a kind of a a scale of social unrest that's happening in the Chinese economy right now, given that we are still facing this kind of soft demand from this pandemic crisis that is not yet over. So I think it's more like quiet rescue, because they also do not want to explicitly say, hey, I'm here to inject X amount of billions into your books to actually rescue you, because they do not want to actually create another moral hazard to the market, saying that, hey, go on, continue your business as usual, property development. At the end of the day, we will still rescue you, because they do not want to actually paint this picture to send a signal to the property developer as well as to the markets down the road. Yeah.
The Evergrande crisis is going to be a major setback for China in the post-COVID-19 scenario. Speculation over Evergrande being China's own Lehman Brothers is rife. How will the Evergrande crisis impact the global economy? Is Beijing hiding the veracity of the crisis, the actual magnitude of what is being grappled with? We pose these questions to Chief Economist and Investment Officer at Tressis Gestion, Daniel Leckel, when asked to give us the real sense of this crisis and is it really the Lehman crisis moment for China, this is what Leckel said.
It's definitely a very, very serious problem for China. Evergrande is the second largest real estate developer in the country, but it's also the largest issuer of commercial paper in China, which means that there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of retail investors that own Evergrande bonds. I think that it's also very serious because other real estate developers have a very similar, highly indebted and very risky strategy and model. Therefore, we need to understand that obviously this might have different implications than Lehman Brothers, but it's a very, very serious situation. It's about the property and real estate sector is about 25% of the GDP of China. Evergrande is about 3% of the real estate property developer sector in China, but other companies are in a very similar situation to the one of Evergrande.
How will the crisis impact the post-COVID-19 economic recovery? We asked Leckel about this. This is how he responded.
It certainly will reduce the pace of the recovery. China was a very important factor of the growth of the world for 2021 and 2022. A reduction in the growth in China is definitely going to impact exporting nations and emerging economies. So it would reduce the pace of the recovery, but not halt it.
The Chinese establishment always maintains the veil of secrecy. So can the real extent of this financial crisis be known? This is what Leckel said.
The Chinese government tends to try to hide these problems under a sea of liquidity, and the level of transparency and corporate governance is quite limited relative to other economies. So it's very difficult for us to know the true extent of the financial hole of both Evergrande and the property developer sector.